Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us for the Grantmakers in the Arts webinar, Implementing the Every Student Succeeds Act in Your State and Local Community. I'm Janet Brown, President and CEO at Grantmakers in the Arts. We're thrilled to have joining us today Alex Nock, Executive Vice President of the Penn Hill Group, a bipartisan education policy development organization in Washington, D.C. Grantmakers in the Arts, through the Arts Education Funders Coalition, has been working with Alex and with Penn Hill for over 5 years on strengthening the role of the arts in federal education policy. Through our efforts, along with the efforts of many other arts organizations, advocates, and networks, we are thrilled that ESSA included several provisions that systematically embed the arts into federal K-12 funding. We know there are many questions about its implementation, particularly in light of the uncertainty that comes with a new administration. Alex will discuss the most current developments with ESSA implementation and arts education policy. After his presentation, I'll facilitate a question and answer period. So throughout this presentation, you can type questions into the rectangular text box at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer those during the Q&A session at the conclusion of the presentation. So I'll turn this over to Alex Nock. Alex.
Thank you, Janet. Good afternoon to everybody. We are going to start off with kind of a brief overview of where we are right now with ESCA and the arts. So as Janet mentioned, the Every Student Succeeds Act passed, and it amended or changed or reauthorized, a term we like to use here in Washington, D.C., the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So ESSA, or the Every Student Succeeds, and ESSA and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act are more or less kind of the same thing for these purposes. People will use those terms interchangeably. So just briefly to review kind of where we are. The arts are included in the statutory definition of a well-rounded education, which is in the law. This definition was updated to kind of reflect some current kind of member interests in different subjects, but we maintained the inclusion of the concept and the term the arts in this definition. ESCA in turn includes the concept of using certain federal funds for well-rounded educational activities across the statute. It includes it in the Title I program, which is probably the nation's biggest federal K-12 education program focused on disadvantaged and low-income kids. In addition, it focuses in on using this concept in Title II teacher training funds, the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program, which is over $1 billion in after-school and extended learning time, and also a brand new program, which we'll talk about more later, in terms of student academic enrichment. Currently, the existing body of regulations that were put out by the Obama administration and an existing kind of state plan application package, or what's called a template in federal education policy terms, is out, and it is allowing states to determine essentially who will provide for a well-rounded education and how they'll do it. So states are going through a planning process right now, some very much near the end of the planning process. About 20 states are trying to submit in April, but about the remainder, 30-some-odd states will be submitting later in the year. But they're looking through and determining, all right, how are we going to address well-rounded educational opportunities for students in our state, specifically the Title I dollars, Title II, and what have you. Moving to the next slide here, we've obviously, because we've had a change in administration from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, we have a new Secretary of Education. Secretary DeVos's, it's literally been Secretary DeVos's first few weeks in office. I think this is probably her 4th week, probably starting today, actually, give or take. The department has been mostly focused with trying to get their folks in place and get their policy kind of foundation laid down. Secretary DeVos has talked about the fact that she's evaluating existing programs and structures at the department. This is not an atypical comment for a new secretary to make, whether it be a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, especially after you've had 8 years of one-party control of the executive branch transferring to the other party. That secretary will often look to see what's working in the department, what isn't, what programs make sense, and what don't make sense. We expect to hear a lot more information about what particular education budget priorities that Secretary DeVos, President Trump, and the rest of the administration will pursue during the week of March 13th. That's when the administration is expected to issue what we call here in D.C. a skinny budget or a condensed budget. For those of you that have followed the federal government's financing opportunities in years past or financing mechanisms in years past, typically the president in February proposes in early February proposes a comprehensive budget that lays out the funding goals for his or her administration. When a new president takes over, obviously they're getting inaugurated on January 20th, so the ability to put together a full budget by early February is practically non-existent. So typically what new presidents do is put out a quote-unquote skinny budget or more concise budget within weeks of taking office. That's what we expect the administration to do the week of the 13th. There's been several dates that have been issued about which exact day. The latest date is March 16th, a Thursday, so we'll see if that changes. The administration is also, however, expected to put out a full-fledged comprehensive budget, the traditional budget that an administration puts out, by early May. So those are two kind of issues to watch and deadlines to follow. Ooh. Oh, there we go. Okay. Sorry, a little technical difficulty there. There we are. I kind of alluded to kind of state timelines earlier on this law. So if you look at the totality of what's going on, President Obama signed the Every Student Succeeds Act into law in December of 2015. Since that point in time to probably literally the last day they left office, about a year, President Obama and his education secretary at the time, John King, was working on regulations and other aspects necessary for the U.S. Department of Education to implement the law. Essentially, the Obama administration signaled early on, and Secretary DeVos has decided to kind of keep this submission structure, but they signaled early on that states would have 2 windows of time to submit state plans. The first is submissions by April 3rd, 2017, and the second is submissions by September 18th, 2017. At the tail end of the Obama administration, as I mentioned, states essentially let the department know when they were going to submit their plans, and about 20 states or so, maybe a little bit more, said their intent was to submit in April, and the remaining states said their intent was to submit in September. Nothing about that initial estimate by states was binding. A state could decide today that they are submitting in a later date, depending on kind of how the final product of their state plan is being developed. Oh, boy. Okay, I'm not going to use the spacebar anymore. So one of the things that a new administration focuses on when it takes over is it goes back and looks at the regulations that have been issued by the past administration, especially those that have been issued recently by the past administration. So the Trump administration is essentially acting no differently than the Obama administration did before that, the Bush administration did before them, and the Clinton administration did before them. So what President Trump issued actually on the day he was inaugurated is a memo from White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus, which essentially said that there is a regulatory freeze that is going to exist for 60 days. That takes us to March 21st, and under this freeze, essentially, any regulations that were not yet final, essentially their implementation was being frozen. And because the Obama administration put out the regulations that govern state plans and accountability in late November, it essentially, these regulations were not 100% final. They had not been actually placed in the Code of Regulations. It was under a 60-day kind of window where there was a delay kind of in implementation, and so these regulations have essentially been stalled in terms of their application as the administration looks at them. Simultaneously, the Congress has undertaken several efforts to roll back recently promulgated regulations from the Department of Education through a provision called the Congressional Review Act. This is a law that Congress passed actually quite a few years ago, almost over 30, I believe, that essentially allows the Congress to overturn or repeal individual regulations issued by the executive branch if they were issued in a fairly recent window. Essentially, the window for the Obama administration regulations is everything past about mid-June. So if a regulation was issued in July, August, September, October, or November, such as the regulations that govern state plans under ESSA and accountability, they are subject to being reviewed by Congress under the Congressional Review Act. In terms of what's going on with this particular exercise here, the House has passed a resolution, the House of Representatives has passed a resolution repealing these regulations. The Senate has not yet acted on this resolution. We expect they may consider it next week. It may be the week after. For anyone that's followed the Senate recently, it's a 52-48 split between the Republicans and the Democrats. So any sort of little hiccup in terms of one party to the other can drastically change the outcome of the vote. So we're not 100% sure what happens in the Senate, but there is a possibility, certainly, that the Senate would pass the resolution that the House passed. It would then go to President Trump for his signature. The administration has already indicated that he would sign this, and essentially the effect of that would be to overturn or to repeal the regulations that the Obama administration put in for this. I'll go about this. I'll cover this in a little bit more later, but I first wanted to give you a picture here, a picture for the viewers about which states have indicated when they will submit their ESSA plan. So if you are in a state or working with a state or have grantees that work with a state that are looking to submit their plans in April, you can kind of get a picture of where those states are. Then you have the vast majority of states, not vast majority, but the majority of states that are looking to submit their plans by September 18th. Obviously, the April states are looking to submit their plans. They can kind of have a really clear indication, probably by the early summer, about essentially how they're going to implement this law next school year. Obviously, if you were submitting by September 8th, let's say September 17th, for instance, you've started the school year already probably. So, you won't have as good an indication, but likely these states will work to implement these plans as the school year begins. One of the other aspects that's gone on here is that Secretary DeVos just very recently, actually a little less than 2 weeks ago now, issued really her first piece of guidance to the states on ESSA implementation. Secretary DeVos wrote to the chief state school officers, that's the head official in each state that governs K-12 education, providing some clarity on a number of aspects that states were having questions on between the end of the Obama administration and now the start of the Trump administration. First and foremost, she said that the states can continue to think about submitting their plans to the federal government, to the U.S. Department of Education by April 3rd or September 17th, depending on what they want to do. In addition, Secretary DeVos also talked about that states could use their existing state plan template as a guide to essentially submit what they are already working on. Obviously, for many states, they have been undertaking this implementation effort since the early spring of 2016, and they are far down the road of talking with stakeholders and talking internally about how they want to move forward with this law. Secretary DeVos, though, also said that the department is going to put out a new template, not necessarily a new set of regulations, but a new template for states to follow if they wish by March 13th. And that new template is not supposed to have new requirements for states, but supposed to possibly be a subset of the existing templates requirements. And then lastly, Secretary DeVos said that states can come up with their own template, either individually or with groups of states, working through the Council of Chief State School Officers, CCSSO, and submit that template. I think that is probably going to be the most challenging one for states. To come up with their own template. States are going to want to know what they're submitting has a chance of being approved. So I think for your April states, you're going to see people submit what they've been working on. For your September states, it's certainly possible that they may look at a different and new template from the U.S. Department of Education that will be issued on March 13th and think about how to crosswalk some of their work over. That will obviously take, some effort to do that, but some states may be interested in doing that. I do think the least likely outcome is lots of states taking advantage of the ability to make up their own templates. Now, most importantly, you may be asking, so okay, well that's a good overview of what's going on, but what do I do about all this? Well, there's a couple of key moments here. One, if your state is planning to submit its plan in April, so if it was on that list a couple slides back, just to kind of put that up there again for folks so they have it. If your state is on this list as an April 3rd submission state and they actually submit by that date, then a lot of your work should be focused on our recommendation here would be focusing in on not necessarily plan development, but how the state's going to implement its plan, how the state's going to work with school districts and schools within the state to implement its plan, and where does the arts and the concept of well-rounded educational activities fit in there. It is possible that these April states right now are having one last chance at public comments. If you go to your Chief State School Officer's website, your state educational agency's website, it's very likely that they have it up for you to review and submit any final comments before they finalize it before submission to the U.S. Department of Education. So there's a chance you could weigh in, but states, again, if they've been working on this for several months or many months now, are probably unlikely to make massive changes in their plans. So your time is probably better spent focusing on, okay, here's the state's plan. How are they going to look at working with school districts on this? How are school districts going to apply for funds? How are schools going to use this? As many of you certainly know in the work that you do, state direction is important, but the rubber meets the road really at the school district and certainly the school level. So then if you are a September state, and again, we'll just keep that slide up there so you can kind of look to see who is and who isn't a September state. Your state is very much still in the planning process and is likely nowhere near a final state plan. They've likely thought about a lot of stuff, considered a lot of stuff, but there's definitely a chance to engage. Your state is likely doing public forums, taking public comment, may have a draft plan out that people are, state officials are seeking input on. There it's very important to carefully look at and analyze what, what is going on and what states are doing to address the arts and what sort of direction and leeway they're providing to states and school districts as they look to address the arts. As I just said, certainly states set a certain level of expectation around what school districts and schools can do, but in the real world, kids don't go to classes at the state educational agency. They go to classes in school districts and in schools, and that's where this money really hits out and gets used for services and to pay for teachers and classes and curriculum. So, and there, in both instances, I should say, in an April state or a September state, what is going to come secondarily is what this next slide deals with here, is that as states finalize their applications to the feds and submit them, they will then be turning around and asking school districts to submit applications to them for their resources, addressing a lot of the same issues. This is a real chance for all of you and the grantees that you work with to actually engage with school districts as they lay out how they're going to use their Title I money, how they're going to use their Title II teacher quality money, how they're going to use their 21st Century Community Learning Centers money, how they're going to use their Title IV money. Here we flagged this in this slide here, that there is essentially a new program that was included in the Every Student Succeeds Act called the Title IV program, or the Student Support Services program, that essentially allows school districts to address needs that they feel are the most important for them to address as they seek to kind of improve the academic achievement and kind of functioning of their schools. Essentially, it asks school districts to essentially do a needs assessment of kind of where their needs hit, what their kids need, what their teachers need, and then use funds to meet those needs. Congress has not yet appropriated funds for this program because it's a new program, and we expect as Congress finalizes the budget for the fiscal year that we're presently in, they will appropriate funds for this program. It could be anywhere from $300 million to $1 billion nationally, and the great value in this is school districts will be getting money under a funding stream that they have not yet previously had before. So if any of you have ever encountered states or school districts and said, hey, can you use your Title I money for this or Title II? And they say, well, we could, but we do these 10 things with it, and that takes all of our money up, and which of these 10 things should we stop? Enterprising and creative school districts often say, yeah, let's see if we can do something different. But for a school district that's a little more regimented, who might not be looking to change, they can kind of rely on the fact that money's spoken for. Here, this money's not spoken for, and it's a real chance to kind of look at what can be done to move the ball forward around the arts and other supportive programs and initiatives. So I think Janet, I think we've hit the end of our prepared slides here. Yes. And so I'm very happy to answer any questions or respond to any commentary that's important.
Great. Thanks, Alex. So I have one sort of overarching question or something that needs to be clarified here, and that's that there's kind of that there's sometimes a misunderstanding about what's going on right now in Washington in the Department of Education, because from those of us who don't follow that federal bureaucracy as closely, or understanding of Congress and laws versus regulations. So so I just want you to clarify a little bit about the secondary, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is the law, is not being repealed. I mean, could it be repealed? And what's the difference between that and the regulations that have some questions around them right now? So can you clarify those two things for those of us who are a little bit more novice about
Sure, and those are great questions, actually. I wouldn't even really view those as novice questions, because, those certainly are things that people should be thinking about. So can Congress or the administration essentially end or eliminate the Elementary and Secondary Education Act or repeal it. The baseline kind of answer to that from a technical standpoint is yes, Congress could pass a bill to eliminate, repeal, wash away, do away with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and any amendments made to it. That, I don't know how to say that, that is not going to happen. Janet knows me, I hardly ever say something with 100% certainty, but that's not going to happen. That act puts out $22 to $24 billion in funding as a whole to school districts and states and schools out there for the education of low-income and other disadvantaged children. It is woven into the fabric of a lot of funding mechanisms and funding situations for individual schools, while the federal government funds the amount of federal funds that kind of factor into the overall expenditure on K-12 education is around 8 or 9%, so certainly nowhere near a majority. For some schools, it is 50 to 40 to 60% of the resources they get, especially for very, very high schools, very, very high low-income populations. So it's an integral cog in how schools, many schools across the nation, actually fund their educational efforts. So it's not going to get repealed. But I think the other question to think about is the one that you asked about regulations and law and those aspects. So if you were to create kind of a hierarchy in your mind, probably at the top of the food chain here is the statute, or the actual law that Congress passes and a president signs into law. That winds up in the U.S. Code. It's the law. It's essentially the blueprint upon which an agency implements a particular program or requirement. Secondarily to that, but also very, very important to that, are regulations that are issued by federal agencies. So the executive branch has the authority to issue regulations, in this case the U.S. Department of Education, to help further with or to clarify things in a statute to allow them to be implemented. Here, the Obama administration, in the regulations on state plans and accountability under ESSA, issued regulations in late November to help clarify a number of provisions, provide additional information, and provide some direction in different ways around the statute. Those have the de facto force of law, but they are not the statute. They are interpretations by the agency of the statute. Sometimes Congress isn't always 100% clear in everything they pass. I know that's going to shock everybody that's on this call, on this webinar, that sometimes they don't 100% say exactly what they mean, and agencies have to say, well, what does that actually mean? And if we're going to put money out, what is expected of school districts or schools to do? So often, departments of education will issue regulations when it comes to programs like this, and that's what the Obama administration did. Probably third on that totem pole, which you may see an increasing use of, is essentially non-regulatory guidance. That's actually this letter that we showcased earlier, which I'm backing up here on the slides on just to remind people of. This letter that Secretary DeVos put out is actually an example of non-regulatory guidance. It is a piece of direction from the department that the department put out that said this is how they will implement a law. It didn't go through public comment. It doesn't have necessarily the force of law per se, but here's what the department expects, so it's a pretty important aspect. I think, Janet, one of the really important things about this particular area for folks that are concerned about the arts is twofold. A regulation can be pulled back, but the important thing about ESSA and now the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is there are a number of provisions in statute which guarantee that the arts can be used as a use of funds under Title I, under Title II, under these programs. So the state plan provisions that are in this regulation, the guidance that might come out from the department cannot wash away the fact that the Elementary and Secondary Education Act allows these programs to fund the arts in a systemic way and expects states to talk about how they are going to fund the arts and other well-rounded educational activities in their state plans. So even if the regulation gets repealed, these provisions don't go away, and states and school districts still need to respond to them. Did that respond to your question, Janet?
Yep. So yes. So the law stays in place. ESSA is not going to go away. How it is interpreted by the Department of Education is what we're talking about.
And that could change. Secretary DeVos is going to have a different point of view, possibly, than Secretary King. And I would have argued that a Clinton administration secretary also would have had a different view, probably, than Secretary King on certain aspects of ESSA. It's not surprising to see different things stressed from one administration to the next. People should view that as kind of normal discourse here, but the question that remains right now is, if these regs get repealed, what does the department replace them with? I think the great thing for us is the statute already speaks to the issues that we care about.
Right, and that's not going to go away.
Correct.
So, so what then are really the issues covered in the regulations that you think are in jeopardy? This is not the law, but the regulations. And are the arts part of any of that?
If I can take the second question first, no, the arts are not really part of the provisions of the regulations in jeopardy in terms of how they can be used under ESSA. It is possible that if and when the regulations do get repealed, and depending on this new state template that comes out from the department, the concept of how you use your funds for well-rounded educational activities may be emphasized less. The department has basically said they're not going to emphasize things more in this new state template, so it may be less of an integral aspect of a state plan, at least in terms of what the DeVos administration is expecting and requiring from folks. Again, it doesn't eliminate the statute and doesn't eliminate the ability of state and local folks to work with their school districts and their states to utilize the provisions in the statute that deal with this. So most of the controversy around the existing regulation deals with provisions around the accountability requirements under the law and how the Obama administration chose to regulate on it. For instance, this is an example I often use. In the accountability requirements under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, states have to factor in assessment participation in their accountability systems, so they have to put some sort of weight on the fact that at least 95% of students in each school and in each subgroup in each school actually took the state test. The idea behind that provision is that if you don't have wide uptake of the assessments in a school, you can't truly gauge the academic achievement of how students are doing in that school. Whether you agree or disagree with that policy, that was the intent, essentially, behind that provision in the law. The statute is silent on what it means to factor in this concept of assessment participation in a state's plan and in its accountability system. The Obama administration essentially said there are 4 options that states could choose from in terms of factoring that in. Some folks have bristled at the fact that the Obama Department of Education was providing any guidance and wanted states to decide it on their own. I should say that the 4th option under the Obama selections was an option developed by the state, so it kind of seemed like it covered everything. But it's those sort of things where some in Congress feel the John King version of the Department of Education overstepped its bounds and its regulatory authority and provided too much detail or direction in the regulation.
Great. So here's another question. What is the status of H.R. 610, the Choices in Education Act for 2017, and how would it impact what we're discussing today?
Sure. So this is a bill that has gotten an outsized level of attention from many folks out there in what I call the real world. Eileen and I live here in Washington, D.C., so we live inside the Beltway, which is, we both have real lives, and my kids have real lives and go to school and everything, but obviously the vast majority of America lives outside of Washington, D.C. So H.R. 610 is a bill introduced, I believe, by Steve King from Iowa, a Republican, pretty conservative member of the House of Representatives, and essentially it seeks to eliminate the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, repeal it, and essentially replace it with a block grant to the states where states could use it for a wide range of activities. I think it also allows a concept around private school vouchers, essentially federal dollars used to pay tuition at private schools for children. The bill and this sort of concept has been proposed before. I think this falls into the category much like the repeal of ESSA, and maybe that's why that question was asked. That bill is almost completely unlikely to get any traction and movement. Part of the reason that bill has gotten some additional traction in terms of, not traction, but attention, I think is a better word, is that President Trump on the campaign trail talked about, one, eliminating the Department of Education, and two, essentially using $20 billion in existing federal funds to create private school vouchers. Again, whether you are for or against kind of a private school voucher concept, most thought he was talking about using the funds under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act for that purpose. We may still yet see a proposal like that as part of his budget that comes out probably in May rather than the smaller one that comes out in March. But that proposal, both the King proposal and the at least what you heard about from that proposal from President Trump when he was then candidate Trump on the campaign trail, there aren't the votes in Congress to pass it, not even close. I don't think you would not even get close to a majority in the House. You certainly wouldn't get it in the Senate, and there would be a significant number of Republicans in both the House and the Senate, in addition to congressional Democrats who would not vote to eliminate the Elementary and Secondary Education Act or turn all of its money over to private school vouchers. But it's
great.
A good question. It's coming up a lot.
Yeah.
And Steve King should be very proud his bill's getting this much attention. I've never seen it before like this. So.
Right. Well, I think it's also an indication of a very nervous constituency.
Very true.
Yeah. So this question kind of gets us to the local level, which is what we want to certainly want to end with today, but we're not going to end. But this question gets us there. Certainly, there are as local school districts and schools put their plans together for Title I, Title II, Title IV money. They have a lot of, and you mentioned this earlier too, they certainly have a lot of ways to use those dollars.
That is right.
And needs, especially in high schools with high poverty levels. And so how do arts advocates utilize what's in the statute now to make the argument to a school that maybe has never used the arts before with any of that federal funding, that the arts are certainly going to be a benefit of their state plan, not a deterrent to the state plan, or to their local plan that will come through the state. So can you just talk a little bit about that local advocacy work and maybe some language around the preparation for the folks who have never used the money they've been getting all these years for the arts?
Sure. So first and foremost, obviously, all of you and the grantees and the folks you work with have a story about why the arts matter and why it can provide impact, right? So I think I probably don't need to kind of point out the obvious, that I guess I will since I started this sentence, but that obviously your first and foremost piece of information is why does this matter, what sort of results you can achieve, and the power and reason you're doing the very work that you do. Second to that, though, and a very important development to ensure that school districts, states, and schools, I guess for lack of a better term, felt comfortable doing this, is GIA, worked very hard to ensure that the actual law, the actual, when we talked about those three tiers of kind of governing documents, for lack of a better case, the law, regulations, and then non-regulatory guidance. The law very clearly now says that you can use federal education resources to support arts education and the arts. There were several states, as Janet knows, who put up barriers to school districts and others using federal Title I dollars and other resources for the arts, either because they're worried about being audited, they're worried about not getting their applications approved, they were worried about some sort of barrier to essentially being able to access the funds that they needed to access to help disadvantaged children. And in this instance now, the law is very clear and says that you can use these resources for arts and arts education. So there is not a legal barrier, not that there necessarily was before, but there's not a perceived legal barrier or perceived audit barrier or something like that, which is very, very important in terms of clearing the decks for folks like all of you to go directly to states and school districts and say, the law says you can use it for this. Here are the results you can get with the work that we're doing, that our grantees are doing, that actually helps with disadvantaged kids or expands skills here or adds enrichment there. And wouldn't it be great to scale up, replicate, expand the work that we're doing through a partnership with us and with you, and you can support your end of it with federal resources. That in and of itself may be enough for some school districts to open the door and say, yeah, let's talk about that. We've wanted to do this. We were concerned about it. Or two, wow, we didn't realize you guys had the impact you had with your program. Let's talk about using it to get those sort of results that you got here in our school district with our kids. And then lastly on this issue, and I want to make sure that we underscore this, is there is a place in the law when it gets funded that it will not already be spoken for, and that's this Title IV program. That is where a school district can't say, yes, we've been using this money for 10 years for X, and we have a contract with somebody, and we can't let go of the contract, and we pay for it every year with our Title I money. This is money that has not yet been accounted for, has not yet been expended, that contracts on which have not yet been written. It's an excellent opportunity there to engage with your school districts, with your schools, with your states to say, hey, these are new resources. The statute specifically speaks, the law in this instance again, speaks to the fact that you can use these money for well-rounded educational activities, including the arts. What can we do here, to move this forward? So there is one, the story that all of you tell when you talk about the value that the arts has with kids and with schools and teachers. And then two, making sure that states and school districts know there are not audit, legal, and other barriers to using the resources for this. And three, there's new money on the table. Well, there will be. Once Congress finishes its work for the current fiscal year, there will be new money on the table that isn't encumbered by existing contracts.
That's great. So this is I'm not sure you can answer this question because we haven't seen state plans yet, but I'm going to ask it so that you can tell me you can't answer it or you can. How are states including arts education in accountability in the ESSA plan? So
I've had the fortunate opportunity to go around and talk to a number of states about how they're implementing ESSA in general. And most states don't seem to be picking up the arts as an accountability measure. A few states, for instance, I think Maine, if I remember, had already, actually not had already, but last spring had redone their accountability system, and it had included a measure of whether or not students are taking certain arts courses that are required for high school graduation as part of a accountability system they were planning on implementing. Maine probably has had to change it around some to meet with the new law. But the place where you see some states thinking about how to incorporate the arts is in what we call the fifth indicator under the accountability system that ESSA requires. So just in brief, this is going to sound a little nerdy, Janet, but I'll make it as clear and concise as possible, is ESSA says to states, you need to develop an accountability system with essentially 5 indicators. or 5 categories of indicators. First is how students do on test scores, both math and reading, at the elementary, middle, and high school level, and that's across the board for all different sectors, the elementary, middle, and high school schools that are in a school district. Secondarily, the school districts, states have to include a measure of high school graduation in their accountability system. Now, obviously, if you're in elementary school, you don't have kids graduating high school, right? So that is they may eventually graduate high school, but you are far removed from whether or not they graduate high school. The high school indicator is something solely for high schools. In its place for elementary and middle schools is essentially a state-determined pick of academic, indicator of academic achievement in some ways. It could be attendance, it could be other test scores, something like that. Third or fourth, depending on your point of view, because obviously an elementary school has 4 indicators, a high school has 4 indicators, is the proficiency of English language learners on state English language proficiency assessments. Essentially, how are your English language learners in your state acquiring English? And then fifth, or fourth, depending on your point of view, this 5th indicator is a state-determined indicator of student supports or academic achievement, and it can be essentially a wide array of indicators, everything from how students are doing on AP test-taking rates to school climate surveys to parent satisfaction surveys. Some states in their early deliberations on state plans, I don't know if anyone who's adopted this yet because I haven't seen final plans from all the states, have talked about some elements of the arts factoring into that equation. And you don't have to have just one 5th indicator. You can have multiple 5th indicators if you so choose as a state. So that's where part of the discussion has gone, and a lot of this, frankly, has been driven, Janet, by actual public input that states receive. So I will say that a lot of states have made a very strong effort to try and solicit public opinion about how to implement this law. I think partially that's due to the fact that if folks remember No Child Left Behind, that was the last big change or iteration of this statute. That was passed in 2001. So here we are 16 years later, where some states are about to get into a position to implement a new law. I think states realize that Congress doesn't get to this law every 4 to 5 years, and it's an important opportunity to look at kind of what their constituents or public want out of it. So I think some states are considering this, Janet. I think the question is how many states will actually implement this. I think that remains to be seen.
That's great, and because we have such super resources of people in the audience, I can tell you that Ariana Hudson, who's Director of the Arts Education Program at the National Endowment for the Arts, is with us. And she tells me that Kentucky will be presenting how the state is incorporating the arts in the state accountability process at the upcoming Arts Education Partnership State Policy Symposium on March 18th in Washington, D.C.
There you go. So it certainly sounds like Kentucky's doing it. So
yes, exactly right. So that's great, and thanks for that, Ariana. I'm going to end with this question because we have this evening the new president will talk to a joint Congress about budget appropriations. So is there, so I want to talk about 2 things. One is the timeline for Congress to appropriate these funds, and is there a, which I think kind of goes back to when do the state plans due and then individual plans, and then when does the actual funding come, and how long does it, what year are we talking about? And so if you could kind of lay that out for us, Alex. But also, is there a fear that lowering the budget of the Department of Education will take a hit on all of this Title I and Title II, Title IV funding? And in particular, is Title IV in jeopardy because it's new program and new money?
So a couple thoughts on that. One, Congress right now is working on trying to finalize the spending for fiscal year 2017, which began October 1, 2016. For many of you that have watched Congress over the last couple years, Congress almost never, actually it has not since 1994, gotten all of its budget and appropriations bills passed in advance of the fiscal year. So not necessarily a great track record. What is that? That's 23 years, right? Yeah, all right, there you go. So they're still working on that. We expect them to come to some sort of conclusion thereon probably by the end of April. That's when the existing kind of authority that the federal government's operating under, essentially something called a temporary continuing resolution that kind of sounds like what it is. It continues funding from the previous year at that levels. At those levels. That runs out towards the end of April. That's likely when Congress will make a decision on how to proceed. I think our thinking here is they probably will simply punt and say that we are going to continue to fund programs at the 2016 level in the current fiscal year, in 2017, the one we're in. So I think there's a little risk of massive program reductions in the current fiscal year when Congress eventually gets around to finalizing funding for this current fiscal year that we're in. What you will have, though, is a budget, first a skinny budget, then a big budget, a more traditional budget proposed by President Trump and his administration, the first iteration of which we'll probably see that week of March 13th. That President Trump yesterday and his folks have talked about providing a fairly sizable increase for defense spending, $54 billion, if I remember correctly, which is about a 10% increase. For those of you doing the math, obviously that means we spend around $540 billion on defense spending through the normal budget. There's also supplemental budgets and stuff like that, so it's very often that the defense spending is way over $600 billion a year. What he has proposed, though, is to take the $54 billion that he's plussing up on the defense side and reducing other spending for the federal government that is on what we call the non-defense discretionary spending side, essentially education programs, housing programs, environmental programs, healthcare programs, anything that is not defense that is domestic spending. He is going to propose that sort of budget. I think that budget, as he proposes it, is politically impossible to pass on Capitol Hill. You would have Republicans that would be concerned about it, especially once the details come out about what particular programs he may or may not want to propose for funding reductions. So the little bit we've learned about thus far in terms of the education department budget, and I should say that it is the 28th of February, so the 13th or 14th or 16th is still 2 weeks away, and budgets can change between now and then. But what we've learned thus far is that he's proposing likely to take a big cut out of Title II, the teacher training aspect of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, possibly eliminating the 21st century, proposing to eliminate the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program, not cut Title I funding, increased funding for Title IV. Well, increase is a bad word because it's never been appropriated before, but provide more funding than people thought for Title IV resources because they like the idea that it's a flexible nature of funding. So those are some of the initial things that we've heard. I doubt you're likely to see a reduction in Title I funding. There is this possibility that Secretary DeVos and President Trump could propose to allow states to essentially use Title I funding for vouchers, private school vouchers, like we've talked about. Again, I talked about that previously, Jan. I don't think there's the political support to do that. But you will have Democrats and many Republicans be very concerned about a $54 billion cut to non-defense discretionary programs and in the categories that I talked about. I think they also talked about not cutting veterans programs, which are also in that impact. So you're looking at having a wider swath of cuts or a deeper swath of cuts under this proposal to things like education, healthcare, and the environment than you would have otherwise. And a 10% increase for defense corresponds to probably like a 19 or 18% decrease in other programs on the non-defense side if you wall off veterans funding. I just don't think it's politically possible to see those sort of cuts for FY 2018, will no program get cut? No. Some programs will get cut. There'll likely be negotiations. I don't think the big categories of funding we're talking about here, Title I and Title IV in particular, would get cut under that scenario. I will say that I am, Janet, a little bit worried about Title II. I don't think it'll be completely eliminated, but that program has suffered a number of reductions over the past couple years. It used to be around $3.2 billion nationally. It's a little over $2 billion, which is still a big pot of money nationally, but it's lost about a third, if you move inflation out of the conversation, about a third of its buying power over the past decade or so.
Okay, well, I hope that's so the budget that the president is talking about tonight is a fiscal 2018 budget.
That's right, and it's merely a proposal.
That would begin if the government ever began their budgets properly in October.
That is right.
Of 2018.
I would be willing to bet almost anything that the government will not get all its appropriations work done by October 1, 2017 for the 2018 fiscal year. And again, I think the important thing about this is a budget proposal. In the end of the day, Congress is the one that has the last word on spending because they actually have to pass a bill and send it to the president. Obviously, the president can veto it, but then the Congress can override a veto. And I just don't see Congress taking on the level of cuts that President Trump is likely to propose.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's what we know, and we will keep you informed through the Arts Education Funders Coalition about what goes on next with regulations and what happens in the Department of Education with the staffing up, and I also want you to know that we have been in touch with the transition team for Secretary DeVos and have gotten back some positive responses with regards to the arts. She certainly has an arts background, so there's there is an understanding there that the arts are valuable, at least from her personal perspective. So these are all good things for us. I wanted to say that Emily Bozenka from Art Vestors, Ed Vestors in Boston, one of my favorite organizations, also informs me that Massachusetts currently has arts education as an indicator in their most recent draft ESSA accountability plan. So I think a lot of states are looking at that, and a lot of that has to do with the advocacy that you've done on the local level. So again, I just want to thank Alex for everybody on this call, and I want to thank Alex for his help and his work that he does for us and his firm, Penn Hill Group, and all of our funders who have made that possible over the last 5 years. It's a delight for me to work with people who are so well respected within the education community in Washington, D.C., and Penn Hill and Alex Nock are certainly some of those folks. The other thing I wanted to just end with is that our advocacy efforts are never over here, and one of the reasons we wanted to, once the ESSA got passed, really was not the end of our advocacy. It really is the beginning, because it means now that what we have to do is try to convince state, federal, state education offices and their Title I coordinators and the people who put their plans together that the arts should be an integral part into their plans, and then on the local level, the same exact argument. And I think that because I'm a local gal at heart, I think this is work that needs to be done on the local level, and it's work that we get our hands dirty with out of love and passion, because we know the people in our community and we know what the arguments should be. So I'm hoping that all of you will get involved in that kind of advocacy, and if you have any questions about process, about how this all works in terms of Title I and Title II, Title IV dollars, please let us know. So again, thank you, Alex. And everyone, please have a great, okay, so I've got to shout out to Bob Morrison. So we're going to add New Jersey, Michigan, and Arizona to the list of accountability, ESSA accountability plan states. So great, this is just great. And Bob Morrison, thank you for all of your great work. So there we go. Thanks, everybody. And I have one little final thing to say I'm supposed to say here. Today's presentation has been recorded. We'll be sending you a link to that file along with a brief survey. We hope that you will take a few minutes to fill out because your input is your feedback is really, really important to us. So thanks again. Continue our great work on arts education advocacy. It never stops, and it's always positive. So thank you, everybody, and let us know if you have any questions.